All right. Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Sales Pipeline Radio. My name is Matt Heinz. Thank you very much for joining us. We are here every week, Thursday at 11:30 Pacific, 2:30 Eastern, live. We've always been live, and now, as you can see in our new format, we are live doing this on LinkedIn, doing it with the full video. I still have a face for radio, but we're turning the video on now as well. If you are joining us live in the middle of your workday, thanks so much for joining us. We've got a good 25 minutes planned, talking a little B2B sales and marketing. If you are listening on the podcast and joining us, and if you're subscribing, thank you so much for listening regularly. If you're discovering us for the first time, you can find every episode, all 278, I believe now, past episodes of Sales Pipeline Radio available, believe it or not, at salespipelineradio.com. We are featuring each week some of the best and brightest minds in B2B sales and marketing. Today is absolutely no different. Very excited to have with us Chief Marketing Officer of Highland, Drew Chapin. Drew, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so we have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions. We have a lot of ground we can cover. But my first question actually is about Xander Schauffele. So it's not every day that I get a chance to interview a B2B CMO who is actually part of the marketing mix, is sponsoring a PGA golf professional. And I mean, you see this with Workday, you see this with, I saw this with Concur and Jason Day. And I'm just curious, like, what goes into, like, a lot of marketers are thinking about webinars and trade shows and driving pipeline. I'd love to hear the backstory of how this came to be and how this became part of the marketing mix for Highland.
That's a great question. That sponsorship has really been a lot of fun. It really started with my boss, who runs sales, marketing, services, and customer success, being interested in sports sponsorship. It's more like the chairman's choice strategy, if you will. Hey, go sponsor this team or this this player. We were able to talk him into slowing things down and letting us kind of think about it more strategically. And we partnered with our agency partner and did some research. And what we learned was the audience that we coveted, what they were interested in were things like golf, tennis, Major League Baseball. And so we landed on golf because of its global reach. And we were lucky that Xander Schauffele was available and interested in a partnership. Mm-hmm. And we've been at this for about a year and a half now, and it's been a lot of fun. We created a integrated campaign with Xander that's in market and doing really well. We're getting a lot of engagement and conversions from the content that we created with him. So it's been a lot of fun.
That's awesome. I'd love to have you talk a little more about the X Factor campaign, because I actually spent a little time with this the other day. It's a really great way of taking, just like, you got a guy who is, who's on, who's on the tour, who's on TV every weekend, or if it makes the cut most weekends, right? And so giving obviously some value to the brand, but then how does that play in? I mean, do you have to negotiate with the player or their agent for how much time they'll spend on this? And then how do you, clearly this is a brand and demand effort for you. How does that come to be, and how do you sort of build that mix?
Yeah, getting into a little bit of the detail is you do negotiate for his time, and that's what essentially you're paying for. You do get some branding. Right now we're on Xander's sleeve, but we pay for content creation. So he participates in a production day annually with us. We're able to create video. He's done interviews for us on podcasts and other formats as well, and that's all negotiated. And so that's been something that we negotiate up front. But as far as the X Factor campaign, we have a hard time explaining to our buyers and our customers what the value that Highland provides. And one of the ways that my boss and our CEO has explained it, it's kind of like a Swiss Army knife. It's like a tool that you can use to solve a lot of different problems in your organization, and it's kind of like an X Factor, right? It's like some special sauce that you can apply to fix a process that might be broken or to automate a workflow. We work a lot with unstructured data and with what we do. And so, we kind of see Highland as an X Factor for our business, and we just kind of fell into the, off the luck tree and hit every lucky branch on the way down that Xander was available. And we have that mnemonic connection between, the X Factor and his name.
That's really cool. And it's got to be also like, there's a halo effect there in terms of, people joining the company and sort of thinking that it's pretty cool to have, the company, I mean, it's on the sleeve, but like to see your company name on TV on the weekends. And there's got to be some cool X factors internally for that as well.
Definitely.
Want to talk about the broader sort of sales and marketing mix. We're 12 months after we all kind of went in a hole and tried to stay away from a global pandemic. Talk a little bit about how the marketing mix has changed for you in the last 12 months. Like, what have you had to pivot to? And now, as we maybe see a little light at the end of the tunnel, what adjustments may become fixtures for your marketing mix moving forward?
Well, I think COVID really accelerated what was already happening in the marketing mix. We were really investing a lot in digital, in our data infrastructure and analytics. And when the world shut down a year ago and in-person events were canceled and that was no longer a viable option for us, we really doubled down in digital, in our paid advertising and our paid search and our SEO efforts and the technology that we use to run our business. And I don't see that going back. I think that digital engagement is here to stay. And the other thing I would say is it's also changed on the buyer side. So where I think historically speaking, the buyer journey was kind of serial as it relates to sales and marketing. Marketing would develop and nurture the opportunity, and then they would hand it off to a sales rep who would handle the from lead to close. Well, now it's a buyer-driven process, and that buyer bounces back and forth between a marketing tactic that they're consuming or a piece of content that they're reading to learn more about your solution and having a conversation with a sales rep. So it really has changed the dynamic on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say that, because I think we're seeing the buying behavior change. And despite the fact we now hit sales and marketing teams that are more remote and more distance from each other, we're seeing evidence that that's actually driving them closer together. Right, that forced into sort of moving away from field marketing events, knowing that there's this more complex buyer. It's forcing sales and marketing teams to work more closely together. We're talking to the Sales Pipeline Radio with Drew Chapin. He's the Chief Marketing Officer for Highland. There's so much ground we can cover here. I want to talk about something that comes up a lot when we talk to CMOs and marketing leaders, especially with fast-growing companies, and it's marketing's role in M&A. You guys have done a lot of M&A efforts in the last, well, I don't know how long time, but it seems like I see you guys associated with sort of acquisitions and growth that way quite a bit. Talk about what that means for a marketing team. I mean, when you're trying to drive growth, when you're trying to drive pipeline, acquisitions can be a distraction and they can be an accelerator. Sometimes both, sometimes one or the other. How do you manage and balance sort of bringing an acquisition in from a marketing perspective with sort of just more evergreen marketing goals?
Well, it's really a great question, and lately we've been on a little bit of an acquisition spree, and so it has created some disruption. I think marketing, Highland, we have a seat at the table when we're making these decisions and evaluating companies. So I'm usually brought in pretty early, and I understand the strategy behind the acquisition, and that sometimes affects the downstream of what you do. Whether you're, are you buying a customer base? Are you buying technology? And that obviously affects the branding decisions that you make. So there's definitely a strategic element of marketing that has to be considered as you're bringing these new companies into the Highland fold. And then, of course, there's a lot of operational decisions that need to be made. So one of the lessons I've learned is that some of these acquired companies have more mature processes than we have, because they're smaller and they're able to move a little bit faster, and maybe they're a little more modern than Highland is. We'll be over $1 billion in revenue this year. And so we've learned not to make quick judgment of, the Highland way versus the acquired company way. We like to take our time to evaluate what our new teammates are doing or we're doing before acquisition, to see if there's anything we can take advantage of with more resources that we have at our disposal at Highland.
It's such a smart approach, I think, because when you're the company being acquired, there's an awful lot of fear and uncertainty around that. And there's an assumption that, like, okay, we lost and the company that bought us won. And there's plenty of companies that treat it that way, right? But if these are going to be your colleagues moving forward, your ability to handle that with sort of some grace and empathy up front and to take your time and be patient with that is an important part of that. Talk about sort of, you were kind of talking about, the elements of sort of culture and team building and sort of respecting the people behind the marketers and the people behind the professionals. I imagine that has been, as a leader, that has been a particular big priority over the last year. Talk about ways that as a CMO, you have prioritized team building and culture in the last 12 months amidst COVID.
Well, we were fortunate to have a pretty strong foundation to begin with. Highland is a very employee-centric and people-centric culture. And so we treat our employees really well to begin with. With COVID, it got more difficult, though, because a lot of what our culture delivers is done in person. Do you ever go visit a Highland office? It has a feel to it. It has a very kind of open and collaborative culture that's happening. And with Zoom and with virtual environments, it was hard for us to bring that culture to our employees. So, last summer we started doing really fun things that weren't work related to help energize and the culture and keep people engaged. One of the example is we had people submit baby pictures of themselves. And then we sent those pictures out to the team and people had to guess who was who. And then we met at 5 o'clock and had a beverage and revealed all of the baby picture names. And it was a riot. We were all cracking up. And we liked it so much, we did a fast follower, which was an activity you did from age like 8 to 12. And so you had like ballerinas and baseball players. And it was a fun way to stay engaged with your teammates on a personal level, since we weren't seeing them in person anymore in the office.
That's a great idea. I think I remember one of my assistants a few years ago, and we were in the office, we used to do sort of birthday celebrations, and she had secretly emailed my wife, and I show up the day and there's pictures of me from high school around the office. And I may not look like it now, but I had long hair in high school. I was a musician. I was trying to go for that. My joke is I was trying to go for like a Michael Bolton look, and I ended up more like a Yanni, or sorry, I was the opposite. I was looking for a Yanni look, and I ended up more like Michael Bolton. It wasn't pretty. I appreciate being follically challenged now. This is way easier to maintain.
Yeah.
But I think, finding ways to create and sort of manage and sort of facilitate that culture is important. Talk about the workplace productivity side of that then. When you've got a distributed team, and I'm not sure, and talk about like how, were you all in the office before this happened, where you have a chance to see each other in the hallways or on the way to get coffee, or, there's always that small talk before and after meetings. Like that's a lot weirder now with Zoom. What have been some of your best practices and lessons in sort of creating, not just connectivity, but sort of productivity and focus for your teams in a remote environment?
Well, the benefit of Zoom, and we're a hybrid, and we're a hybrid organization. We had 60 to 70% of our people in offices and 30% remote. But what it did is it democratized that once the pandemic hit, because everyone was on a level playing field. So our remote employees actually really appreciated the change from making sure their voice was heard and participating in that. In terms of productivity, the thing that we had to be really careful about is fatigue and overworking people, because it's pretty easy to jump on a Zoom and really, it seems to create more work sometimes than it did before, where before you're scheduling breaks or you're making sure you're taking time to decompress, where when you're going from Zoom to Zoom to Zoom, it can get overwhelming for a lot of folks sitting. So what we've encouraged our employees to do is to take breaks. Mm-hmm. Sometimes if they're on an all hands call, listen to it while you're walking around the block or walking your dog. Yeah. And then giving, and at the leadership level, demonstrating that, like, I'll take breaks. I exercise during the day. I want to encourage my team to do that because of the risk of potentially overworking them through the more efficient way that we're now engaging each other.
Yep. I love that. And I found just even managing our small team through this past year, explicit permission and leading by example are really, really important. if I'm going to tell people you need to take your time and take your personal time, and like PTO time is yours, like I can't be doing email on nights and weekends. I can't be checking in on vacation. I love that. I think so many people feel pressure to be on the video and on the Zoom call, when sometimes like you're listening in, you can participate just as well while getting outside, getting some sun, getting some exercise. We do a CMO group, and we have some people that will show up on Friday mornings. Some of them are literally on their treadmills. I've seen a couple people that are on their Pelotons, right? And they're literally just like, they've just set up their camera or whatever, and they're just like getting something else done. So giving explicit permission to that, I think, is really important. We got just a few more minutes here with our guest today on Sales Pipeline Radio, Drew Chapin. He's the Chief Marketing Officer at Highland, and we've been spending most of this conversation talking about you as the seller. I want to flip this around and talk about you as the buyer. So I have to imagine, as the Chief Marketing Officer of a large and growing large growing enterprise software company, you get a handful of sales pitches from time to time. Talk about what gets your attention. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time like SDR shaming, because I think we've all got examples of like the terrible approaches and messages we get. Let's talk about what's working. Let's talk about, what gets your attention. Why does it get your attention? What elements within those seem to be working?
Well, I think when I get introduced to new vendors or new solutions that sometimes I'm not even looking for, it's through Google searches about a problem I'm trying to solve. Mm-hmm. And I land on a thought leadership piece or a blog around, SEO optimization or digital advertising or, AI or, all these things that we're thinking about. And, obviously some of those are traditional channels, but some are newer, more modern. And I land on a vendor site because they wrote an engaging piece that's not really selling me anything. It's just telling me this is the way you may want to approach solving this problem. And oh, by the way, we happen to have solutions that can help you. And so I think that is a great way through, through thought leadership, educational content that is helping CMOs solve their problems is a great way to get my attention.
Well, and I think what you referenced there that I want to cover as well is, not just sort of that value-added content, but CMO level value-added content. Talk about, some ways that, sort of how important is it that someone sort of levels up and understands the perspective you have on a particular problem versus maybe other departments or other people in your organization as a way of creating, more compelling content that gets your attention?
Well, I think for me, it's not just marketing related. So I have my peers across the company. I'm like I mentioned earlier, I'm in M&A conversations. I have regular engagements with our CFO. We're looking at 5-year business plans, and so I am interested in knowing like the CFO perspective on CMO. Like, how do I brief my board more effectively, or how do I brief the CEO better, and things that are related to cross-departmental education for someone like me that doesn't just lead a marketing organization, but is also part of the executive team and has to engage and collaborate across the entire company.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, last question as a buyer, I think, there's plenty of salespeople that say, listen, if I can just get to the top person in the organization, and I think there's a book literally called Selling to Veto, and Veto is an acronym for Very Important Top Officer. So if I can just get to Drew and have the call with him, I'm going to get somewhere. Talk about how you make buying decisions and what the buying committee means within your organization when it comes to deciding to do something.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because nothing bothers me more when I feel like a seller's going around one of my leaders to try to sell to me directly and almost create a wedge between me and someone else on the team. Yeah. And so I would prefer that if someone is trying to sell to me, that they get the buy-in of my leadership first. And that because I trust them to make the right decisions. And by the way, they're the ones that are going to have to live with those long term on their team. So the way, in my opinion, to get to the CMO, and it might be bi-directional, maybe through the thought leadership content we talked about earlier, directed at the C level, but the selling has to happen to get that buying unit and that aligned before the executive gets engaged, because the executive's generally going to go off the recommendation of the buying unit.
Yeah. It's such a good point. And, respecting the buying process and the way that your prospect wants to buy versus the way you think you want to sell. So important. There's sort of this ongoing thread in the CMO Coffee Talk group that we co-manage that, literally there's a hashtag now that is sort of a damn it, and then an analyst firm at the end of that. I won't name names. It starts with a G. It may end with Artner. I don't know. But like the sales tactics that are like copying the board, going over someone's head, saying like a salesperson may feel like that's getting them leverage. I guarantee you it is doing the opposite on your deal. So now good feedback, and I want to make sure we cover that from you as well. Well, we covered a lot of ground here today, everything from golf to empathy to baby pictures of your team, which is a lot of fun. Drew Chapin, CMO at Highland, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll be here again next week, 11:30 Pacific, 2:30 Eastern, live on LinkedIn. If you're listening, we'll have new episodes up on salespipelineRadio.com soon as well. Thanks for listening. My name is Matt Heinz. We'll see you next week.